Okay, I think it's safe to begin since everyone is here. Uh, Thank you for coming to the second day of the Literary Activism Symposium, uh, which we're proceeding with uh, happily, despite all the slight pall of gloom that was cast on it by events at uh, our host university, Ashoka. Not slight, quite a significant pall of gloom. But it's important to continue these discussions and remind ourselves of the primacy of these spaces and of the kind of intellectual freedom which these spaces comprise that you know that we've been that students have been so concerned about, and not just students. I mean, all of faculty and the founders, the admin. So a word about the symposium. This time, the theme happens to be decolonization. I'm going to repeat myself slightly since Subir Sarkar, today's first moderator, says that there might be people in the audience today who weren't around yesterday when I made my introductory remarks. And just to reiterate that the literary activism symposia were created in order to make a space for discussion primarily about creative practice, the arts, uh, and in a way that is no longer possible in the professionalized academic conference, the setting of the academic conference, with its own kind of internal protocols and proprieties, not least to do with the writing of the academic paper itself, which mainly refers to not only the theme of the conference, but to other scholars, but which otherwise remains uncommitted to um, the personality or the contingency or the compulsions of the particular writer of the paper. Or to indeed the time we are living now outside of what the academic conference recognizes as a valid theme for that conference. So on the one hand, there are certain discussions that just cannot take place in certain registers and tones that cannot be sounded in that sort of setting. As I said yesterday, you cannot speak, for instance, as yourself. Um, the other space that we wanted to distinguish this one from is the literary festival, where again you are talking about your latest book, you're pitching your latest book. Uh, the the place is thick with celebrities, and the air is generally celebratory. So we are not here to celebrate. I think when you're compelled to constantly hit the note of celebration, then again, there's certain things which can't be said or explored. So, to escape that particular those registers and tones which prescribe a certain kind of thought process and discussion. How do I now explain why we're having a panel with scientists on it? Given that this symposium is called Literary Activism, the name of the series. We have had uh, different kinds of people on it besides practitioners of a literary genre. We've had, besides poets and novelists, we've had filmmakers, we've had publishers, translators, academics. Um, we've also had twice scientists, um, Sunetra Gupta and Rohit Manchanda, the first from Oxford and the second from IIT. But both of them are also novelists. And they had a certain interest in talking about, especially, I think Sunetra spoke at a symposium called Against Storytelling, where people like myself and the filmmaker Gurvinder Singh were arguing against the precedence that the idea of story takes uh, in a way that we disagree with in privileging narrative. Shweta spoke about quite a few things, including in the world of science. So speaking as a novelist, but also as a scientist, she spoke about how sometimes um, people who fund scientific projects will do so if there's a proper story in the project. I've been told by management people that they too kind of tend to privilege this idea of story. So you can see that there's this overlap of vocabulary going on, which doesn't only apply to writers or people who think about writing. There's a kind of referentiality and meaning accorded to certain words and practices, which might use words that come from literary language, but are now part of our daily way of thinking, but which go quite deep into the decisions we take. For instance, when a manager presents something to their colleagues, whether they're presenting it as a proper story about a product or not. Again, I would say that in what way do I distinguish this panel from, let's say, something similar to literary festival, where the word literary in literary festival seems to expand and in fact marginalize writers and have cricketers and film stars as the main people who are being advertised in a literary festival. So the word literary over there has become so tenuous in its meaning that it seems to be anything but literary. But that is not what is happening here. We're trying to learn a bit about thinking through language in a way that hopefully is shared by people across disciplines, people that include scientists. I'll say a little bit about this particular panel and why it's happening, because the theme is decolonization. That's why it's happening. I mean, I know very little about science. It was one of the subjects I did worst at in school. I cannot speak about this discipline with a great deal of knowledge, and yet, of course, science plays a huge role primarily in the lives of people who don't know anything about science. How many do, after all? And science is also part of a narrative. We encounter that narrative all the time. It is mainly a Western narrative, whether you want to sort of take that on board or not. I mean, all the big noise about science comes out of the West even today in terms of what's happening, what the latest development is. So it came to me a few years ago when the Higgs boson was a big kind of subject of conversation. And I was being deluged. We all were being deluged with information about Higgs and the Higgs boson. I'm trying to remember if the word God came up as well, as it did with Stephen Hawking. We want to kind of understand the mind of God, or some such alluring phrase. So I also saw in those journalistic accounts of that event that there was no idea. I mean, other scientists were being mentioned other scientists from the past were being mentioned in the lead up to the Higgs boson, other physicists, but nobody seemed to have any idea, didn't seem to need to have any idea in all those journalistic accounts that were coming out of the West, in Britain mainly, of what boson was. Not that we know what it is, 99% of the population. or what that word meant. So I asked Shubir, in fact, and another physicist here in Calcutta about the significance of Schutzenbusch. Not that it had any connection, the boson, maybe to the Higgs boson, but I still wanted to know why our knowledge was so absolutely awry uh, and lopsided. Um, and uh, and I think Shubir and his friend, was it Partho, um, said spoke very eloquently about Schutzenbusch's uh, statistical method and what he had done to make that leap, as they said, uh, possible from Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics, if I remember correctly. I may be getting it wrong, forgive me. But they also used words like beautiful and simple for what Bose had done. And so I thought, um, although I'm an ignoramus, I'm going to write something about it, and I did write about it for The Guardian. When I was speaking to the Guardian editor, they said, yeah, gosh, please write about it. We were just talking this morning about Higgs, and then the word boson came up, and then we said, where's boson from? And nobody had a clue and didn't care. So I wrote this piece about Schotten Bose and the boson, and the fact of this lopsided kind of knowledge of the words that were being used in this context. I was heavily trolled, except for a few German scientists who kind of wrote nice comments for that Guardian article. Then this year, among the awardees of the Nobel Prize was Roger Penrose. And in fact, one of our panelists today, Somak Raychaudhury, wrote a piece in the Telegraph. And, he mentioned somebody about whom I'd seen a tiny, sort of almost homemade documentary, such as, the documentaries that you see on DD Bharati when they're taken out from the archive are, about Amol Kumar Raychaudhury. And his kind of mathematical formulations, his achievement. I had seen this documentary then, and I'd been very moved by these unknown figures in science. They might be known within the scientific fraternity, but unknown outside of it. The cultural ballast is what makes a certain certain group of people known and others unknown in this otherwise neutral discourse called science. So I was saddened to be that this was the case, um, and happy that Roger Penrose had spoken to Somak Raychaudhury. I mean, one of the first things he said was, "Are you connected to the other to this distinguished great Amol Kumar Raychaudhury?" So I thought it would be nice to have a panel to discuss some of these matters, these inequities in otherwise a field that is supposed to be the way we measure what is equal and what is objective and what is impartial, science. To see what lies behind these remarks, and their histories and the fact that we don't know about them. So in fact, then that's when I asked Shubir, whom I should introduce at this point as being professor of theoretical physics at Oxford University. I've known him now for quite a few years. A member of the India-Oxford Initiative. It was his idea to get the India-Oxford Initiative on board for this symposium. I'm very glad that he put it to us. So I asked Shubir then, who I should add is also deeply engaged with music, the arts, literature, is a wonderful human being. But that's not the only reason I asked him, that, knowledge that I could easily take advantage of him, but because he knows the people that I would want to take part in such a panel in the scientific fraternity. And that's why we have this wonderful panel here today. And this is the first time we are having a biggish panel in this symposium, and certainly the first time we're having a panel with scientists and such wonderful, distinguished scientists. I'll leave it now to Shubir to introduce them and to go forward with the discussion.
Thank you very much, Amit, for that very generous introduction and for inviting us to join this symposium. So this is part of the bridging cultures that does need to be done, and we are also very grateful to all the other speakers for providing the context in which we can engage in discussion about this subject, which is of course very timely. But let me start by saying the first thing one learns about the other culture is that you start 5 minutes later than you said you would, and you go on for 5 minutes longer than you said, which means we can all be relaxed. That's great, because normally one of the punishments we suffer in science is to be bounded rather more rigidly than you would like to be in our discourse. So allow me to share my screen so that I can point to some of the things that I want to emphasize. So the people who are on the panel today are all distinguished scientists who I happen to have known for quite a long time. And our credentials for being on this panel are basically that we are working scientists. Uh, Partha Majumdar, who you mentioned earlier, said working class scientists, which is actually even more telling, in the sense that we do not normally, I should say, engage in discussions of this kind. However, we do have views which are born out of our actual life experience of having grown up and been educated in a country that was until 1947 under colonialism for 300 years. And we have also, of course, worked abroad, including in the country of our former colonizers. So we have some perspective on these matters. I'll introduce the panelists as they speak. So for now, let me just say that although we are in fact all physicists, we do range across a rather wide range of uh, subjects. Physics is a very broad umbrella. So for example, Ramaswamy works in chemical dynamics, systems biology. Somak is an astronomer. Rohini is a high energy particle physicist, and Subir Bhattacharya works in condensed matter physics. I work mainly in cosmology at the moment. But that's not particularly relevant to this symposium. What matters is that we have very varied experiences, and we hope to bring that to bear in what we will say. I do not want to preempt what people will say, except for mentioning that this is organized, as you mentioned, by the India Oxford Initiative. Now, this is also why all the panelists are Indian. Being colonized, of course, is not a prerogative of Indians, but that is something that we do share. And yesterday, Aditya, who spoke, he's a great admirer of E.P. Thompson. So I thought I would put this quote from the British historian that I'm aware of. There is not a thought that is being thought in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind. That could, of course, be just a statement about statistics. There are rather a lot of us. So, but the India Oxford Initiative is a bit like the symposium. It seeks to provide a common platform and Oxford for people from all the constituent divisions of the university to engage. And to that end, we have already held uh, webinars during the lockdown in medical sciences and concerning museums, social sciences. This is the fourth one, and the last one will be in the humanities. Now, Oxford, of course, is got a very close link to the subject of the symposium, and indeed, there is now a fairly concerted effort being made to address Oxford and its colonial links. The history faculty, in particular, has a entire program on empire, and so have many of the other departments. And the mathematical and physical sciences and life sciences division, to which I belong, they have, in fact, a program on decolonizing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and especially whether our syllabus needs to be addressed in this connection. So I've put up some of these links here for people to look at should they be interested, but obviously the panelists today will not be restricted in any way by the themes that these institutions are exploring. They'll bring their personal points of view. But before I do that, let me just say that we are connected and unified in one respect. None of us believe that science is a cultural construct, or even to that end, a human construct, in the sense that the Higgs boson that you just mentioned, that existed long before Higgs or Bose appeared on the planet. It's been, the laws of physics which have governed the evolution of the universe for the past, nearly 15,000 million years, have been recognized by us and articulated by us, but they do have an existence, as far as we know, independent of us. And it would be the height of anthropocentrism to imagine that we bring them into being. And I don't think any of us think that. And to that end, we also do not, I think, subscribe to notions like science must fall, which was something that came up a few years ago, and which also has a certain ignorance of history in believing that science is entirely a Western European construction, which some of the panelists might elaborate on later. It is certainly not. And this kind of approach obviously attracts ridicule on the same social media on which it finds a platform. And I particularly like this poster that appeared soon afterwards. But it is not our intention to engage with this line of thinking at all. I was amused that a trampoline company actually made money out of this by inventing a new hashtag, which was gravity must fall, which seems rather more germane to this. But we are not going to deal with this. We are instead going to talk within the framework that you have set with the mission statement, which you articulated very well, we thought. And there is no time to discuss this. There are many interesting comments in it, which are all worthy of separate discussions. But I just want to highlight one sentence that resonates with us all, which is that you say, I belong to a tradition that has had multiple inheritances and has had no wish to deny them. And that is certainly something that as scientists, we locate ourselves in. And therefore, without further ado, I would now like to call on my panelists one by one to give their point of view on the topic. And notice that in the title of this debate or discussion, we have specifically put a question mark after decolonizing science, because as scientists, we question everything. That is our day job. And we'll see whether at the end of this discussion, we are any closer to addressing that question mark. So first, can I call on Ramaswamy? He is someone I've known. I just worked it out for about 45 years. I think we first met in the late 70s. He is now at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, but for many years, he in fact taught in the School of Physical Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University next door. And Ram, apart from being a researcher, distinguished researcher, is also had long experience of education and administration. He was Vice Chancellor of the University of Hyderabad for several years and President of the Indian Academy of Sciences. So let's now hear what Ram has to say. Please, Ram.
Thank you very much, Subir.
I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. No, thank you, Subir, and thank you, Amit, and the other organizers of this meeting for inviting us to deliberate on this particular topic. Part of the reason I accepted without knowing very much about it was that I knew very little about the idea of decolonization, and it gave me a chance to step so far out of my comfort zone that I thought it would be at least worthwhile worrying a little about it. As Subir has pointed out, and one tends to take some things somewhat literally, So the first, so when thinking about the process of decolonization, having been, of course, in a country that I grew up at a time when we had quite recently come out of the colonial experience. And one of the things that has been with us in our educational system throughout the past several years has been this whole Macaulayan idea that, that you educate Indians in order to enslave them. But I was in sort of preparing for this talk, I went back to Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, which is now over 100 years old. It was surprising how much he had anticipated the continuing debate that would occupy many of us over many years. That the systems that the Europeans have discarded are the systems in vogue amongst us, he says. And 100 years ago, he was lamenting the fact that we were not evolving our own ideas, but we ignorantly adhere to the cast-off systems. Uh, Now, Gandhi went on to say that in our own civilization, there will be progress, retrogression, reforms, reactions. But he was the first decolonizer and he wanted to drive out Western civilization and all else will follow. Now, of course, I don't mean to be glib, but I mean, he was not that serious. He wanted independence, but part of the reason he wanted independence and the idea of the way in which he wanted to gain independence uh, sort of encompasses a certain philosophy that he had, that it was important to him to use methods that were not dependent on British or Western ideas. So this, and here I'm quoting Akil Bilgrami in his essay on Gandhi, that for Gandhi, it was important not to use Western methods to have the British leave. And this is something that, at least in the early days of our independence movement, and we were always trying very hard to do things in a style that was intrinsically Indian. Now, this hasn't sustained as time has progressed for a multiplicity of reasons, but the attempts to decolonize really go back about 100, 150 years or so. A second strand of discussion that I would like to introduce comes from Richard Kapuscinski, where in describing the colonies of Africa, he says that colonialism fosters social chasms. Colonial policy elevates a class of cultured and reliable natives while pushing the rest of society down on a stratum of poverty and ignorance. And one of the people whom he interviews in this essay goes on to say, we knew exactly as much as they wanted us to know, and now it's hard to change. Now, in talking about decolonizing science, particularly in an Indian context, I would hold that there are two levels at which we need to address this decolonization. Right? One is, as I've said once, or as I've said just now, so many decades after independence and more than a century after Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, some of what he has feared has indeed come to pass. In fact, Subir also mentioned it, that much of the science that we do over here is, if not imitative, at least derivative from the West, and it does not evolve independently or as rapidly as required. Um, there are good reasons why it should, in some sense, also not be so independent of the West, but that is a matter for discussion. Our most well-recognized scientist internationally, the Nobel laureate C.V. Raman, who did phenomenal science and had a strong nationalistic sense, said towards the end of his life that he felt his life had been a failure because all we have is a legion of camp followers of the West. Now, the second decolonization that I think we need uh, to worry about stems from what Kapuscinski talks about, the stratification of our society by our erstwhile colonial masters, or any colonial masters for that matter, into an elite educated group, thanks to Macaulay's universities, and the ignorant and impoverished masses, of which in India still the numbers are very, very large. These distinctions remain in modern day India and very likely in any country with a colonial past. Uh, sorry. Much of Indian science is dominated by an upper caste male elite. Nowadays, it's referred to as Savarna. Uh, Now, this is not true just of science. This is true of a lot of different enterprises in India. But in Indian science tends to be very dominated by male upper caste. So representation of different social groups is low. In our country, as it is sort of well known in most circles, social diversity is actually legislated at all levels through the process of reservations. Sometimes up to 50% of all seats in a university could be for reserved categories. But the barriers are not easy to overcome. And so there are dropouts, poor performances, there's not enough attention paid to this process of social mobility. So reservation is one thing and education is quite another. So effectively what happens is that diversity reduces along the hierarchy, especially when it comes to recognition, that is awards and other rewards, and positions of leadership. When talking about gender, this is usually called the leaky pipeline, but this is as much of a leaky pipeline for any kind of socially disadvantaged group. Um, in terms of recognition and positions of leadership, just as an example, the Indian Academy of Sciences today has over 1,000 fellows who are elected to it. Of these 1,000, exactly 100 are women, and fewer than 100, just by looking at their surnames and not asking for religious affiliation, fewer than 100 come from non-Hindu communities, and fewer than 10 come from socially marginal groups. I'd like to draw your attention to a book, since this is on literary activism. The book is by Kancha Ayalaya, who's a sociologist, the title of the book is Turning the Pot and Tilling the Land, and it talks about the dignity of labor in our times. The blurb for the book goes, who discovered the first detergent soap in India? Who selected and standardized most of the food that we eat today? How did cotton come to be spun into cloth? Who originated the science of making leather out of animal skin? These are all traditionally occupations of lower castes in our country, whether they are potters or weavers, farmers, dhobis, launderers, barbers, leather workers, and so on. So the book actually documents the contributions of the non-Savarna groups to the improving our lives. It's one of the few attempts to highlight some of the practical scientific processes that were born out of local needs and are therefore and otherwise unsung. There are not just traditional knowledge systems in agriculture and medicine and pottery, but this is the local science that we ought to recognize and celebrate. Also leatherwork and also metallurgy. We have the cannons of Tipu Sultan and the guns that came to India or were sometimes fabricated in India. So there has been some kind of a tradition, and we know little about it and celebrate even less. Now, I mean, I would like to just point out that there are these two aspects of decolonizing that we need to consider. But as Subir mentioned also, that we don't necessarily subscribe to the idea of decolonizing in the same way as in other enterprises or other endeavors, because continuity in science is extremely important. Um, Standing on the shoulders of giants is everybody's prerogative, and all of us do it because historical scientific traditions are a part of our common legacy. Uh, we are all descended in some very real sense. We are inheritors of Einstein's legacy, of Newton's legacy, Aristotle, Galileo. All of it really comes down. So the science that we do cannot be divorced from the contributions of what we really should see as our common heritage. The sentence just before the one that Subir quoted in the manifesto for this meeting um, was by Amit Chaudhuri. And I would just like to say it is not an option for us in the sciences to deny that being colonized is a defining cultural category. We are part of a continuous fabric. However, unlike the humanities and in the social sciences, we do not always acknowledge the multiple inheritances of our disciplines, especially in giving a local context for the development of scientific ideas and particularly for their application. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ram. That was fascinating. I'm sure there'll be many questions about that. But let's press on because I'm afraid we are already running nearly 20 minutes over time. So I would request all the panelists to keep to time, please. So our next speaker will be Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. Well, you call him Shovo. And Shovo is a very distinguished physicist. He was formerly director of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which is where I first met him. Presently, he's C.V. Raman Professor at Ashoka, and he's also director of the TCG Centers for Research and Education in Science and Technology, which is based, I believe, in Salt Lake in Kolkata. So, Shovo, would you like to share your screen, please?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay.
And you have 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll try. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Is this an okay screen?
Well,
I want to keep the left.
Screen. Yeah,
I don't want to go full screen because this way I'll if the screen is visible to all of you,
yes,
I'll just go forward. So
I think it's fine.
Okay, so my friend, my students in Ashoka has a nickname for me. They call me the storyteller. And since what I wanted to say had so much in common with Ram, that I thought I'll tell you a story instead. It's mostly made up with some plausibility built into it. And pictures are usually worth 1,000 words. So I begin with this picture. And this is a picture, I won't keep you in suspense. This is a picture from my hometown in Calcutta, which is now called Kolkata. But because of colonized thing, I'll continue to refer to our colonial names, Calcutta. And this is a place called College Square. It's on College Street. And the buildings on the far side are the institutions that were built. This is University of Calcutta, a very famous school named Hare School. Somak and my alma mater, Presidency College, in the back and so on. The important thing to notice is that these buildings have nothing to do with the soil on which they are built, if you look at the architecture. And the most important thing in this picture are these two figures in front. And this is meant to send you a not so subliminal message that the empire is essential to civilize the people who are standing in front. And if you look at the Francis Fritz photographs during that time, you will realize that this is part of the imperial propaganda machine, which used photography to great extent as to why the empire was a civilizing and noble activity and nothing else. Okay. So I think this picture can set the stage for what we are going to say next. So being a scientist, I want to tell you what I mean by science, and like everyone else, all of this comes from Wikipedia, where all knowledge rests. So science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in form of testable and explanations about nature. And colonization, I really like this definition in Wikipedia, refers to large-scale population movements where the migrants maintain strong contact with their or their ancestors' former country, gaining significant privileges over other inhabitants of the territory. And decolonization, as you can see, is the undoing of colonization. Now, I would like to say that science is done by scientists, and therefore there is history, politics, sociology, ethics, aesthetics of science, and even culture of science, about which C.P. Snow wrote an elegant essay called Two Cultures. Many of you know about it. Now that we are scientists as humans, and I think perhaps only scientists could be colonized or decolonized, as Ram just pointed out, because this is part of our faith system. I won't call it anything more. So from outside, you see us as a bunch of nerds doing science, uninteresting folks, but we have our own caste structure, and that tells you that we are just as human as all of you are. So for example, I'll give you my own bias, and this will offend many, and I apologize for that. That when I was a young person, we knew that there were two castes, the upper caste and lower caste. The upper caste was formal sciences, mathematics, logic, etc. Then there were natural sciences, about which I'll primarily speak, biology, chemistry, physics, where the job is to understand nature. And nature remains the central authority in everything we do. So we kind of, over time, has accepted that primacy of nature, that is the only arbiter. Then there are lower castes, engineering and social sciences like economics, sociology, and so on. Please don't mind. I mean, I'm just sharing with you some of the prejudices that our community had for quite a while. For instance, there is a saying from Lord Rutherford, one of the great physicists of all time, that all of science is either physics or stamp collecting. And ironically, Rutherford was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1908, which I thought he must have thought a fate worse than death. So, this is sort of our sociology. Now, let's see. I call it brief history of time. And although, West and East, whether they're together or different, I don't know. But I will use this notion kind of in a historical sense, that in Europe, there was Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and scientific revolution, industrial revolution, political revolutions, and so on. And India, by India, I mean, just as Ram said, upper caste Hindu men. They engage with modern science during colonial times. So what is the central crisis? The central crisis is that imperial powers also produced advances in science. And this crisis led to at least two important reform movements. There may be more, and I only know of two. And one is the Brahmo Samaj, started by Ram Mohan Roy. The other is the Arya Samaj, started by Dayanand Saraswati. One I call cosmopolitan, global, and for the lack of a better word, modernist. The other is indigenous Hindu revivalist. Okay, and the political inheritors on the left side is Jawaharlal Nehru, and on the right-hand side, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. Okay, so this is a background I want to give you, just saying that this, differentiating between science, humanities, social sciences, etc., and politics in particular, is probably not very useful because they are part of the same intellectual tradition begun in very different contexts at a different time in our history. Okay.
So now, 2 more minutes, please.
Sure. How much?
this is very fascinating, but if you could wrap up in another few minutes, that'd be great.
Few minutes. Oh, my goodness. Oh, okay. Okay, so Indian Association for Cultivation of Science is where modern science began. And I'll just very quickly, you can read the rest of it. And if it is available on PDF, or you can just read it. These are some institutions, but Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science is where I think the first phase of decolonizing science began. The words that these people have used give you a sense. For example, I'll just tell you that when Mahendralal Sarkar died, Father Eugene Lafont, a Jesuit priest in St. Xavier's College and the professor of Jagadish Chandra Bose, had said that the agents of the colonial power wanted to transform the Hindus into a number of mechanics requiring forever European supervision, whereas Sarkar's object was to emancipate, and this is my highlighting, in the long run, his countrymen from this humiliating bondage. The point here is that the word emancipate is used in the context like this, that science will emancipate us from the colonial times. And there is something I call the Calcutta miracle. And this is a geography of a very small area of Calcutta. And this is where I quote these 5 extraordinary things have happened. And in post-independence India, despite independence, we have never, ever been able to come anywhere near the achievements of these people. And Bibha Chaudhuri, about which much is being talked about now, was a woman, of course, as the name implies, and the driving force has to be, in my judgment, the freedom movement. So nation building, which is post-independence and is essentially due to perhaps only one man as his vision, and there's Nehru. And he describes to you the idea of post-independence India, which was the nation building phase. And there are science policy resolution of 1958 in the parliament, which is extremely interesting. Those of you who wish to read his discovery of India and the science policy resolution that he proposed are extremely interesting to understand where science stood in this post-nation building phase. These are, I call the men who would be king. And this is Bhatnagar, Bhabha, Raman, Sarabhai, and Mahalanobis, and they built all these institutions. Bhatnagar studied in Oxford, Bhabha, Sarabhai, and Mahalanobis came from Cambridge, and Raman was homegrown. So I just finish with the comments made by Pandit Nehru in 1947, that science must think in terms of a few million persons of India, that science has to do something for the people. And the comment of Dr. Manmohan Singh, the centenary of Indian Science Congress, which he points out that we haven't done much at all. So this is a judgment of our political leaders. Finally, I just want to say that the pre-independence and post-independence science in India were driven by freedom movement and nation building. And nation building is coterminous with what I call the recolonization, and why that is led by the ones colonized is beyond me to understand. Knowledge in the service of an empire and of an independent nation state, are they different, particularly in science? If so, how so? Education remains Western style institutions are run by indigenous governance systems, which I call Gurukul and Gharana, and persistence of two cultures. And in my own university, the persistence of two cultures is extremely visible. The 3 people who are outside India provided the greatest insight into us, and they are the great mathematician Andre Weil, Max Born, and J.V.S. Haldane. And you will I encourage those of you who want to know more to read their writings about that period. And I end with this hopeful note that when Galileo was imprisoned and under house arrest. And this I got from Professor Malavika Sarkar. She told me about this painting, it exists in Tate, that Milton came to see him when he was blind and under house arrest. And I end with the hope that when some of us are under house arrest, that some of you poets will come to see us before we lose our sight. With that hope, I thank you.
Thank you, Shobha. That was absolutely fascinating. And I do apologize for cutting you short, but we could have gone on for longer than an hour on that theme alone. It seems to me that you are definitely writing a book about this, which I look forward to.
Yes, I do. Okay.
And just to mention that Galileo, although he was under house arrest, his daughter lived next door and brought him hot meals every day. I've visited his house on Arcetri in Florence. So he wasn't so badly off. Anyway.
Sorry about taking too much time.
Not at all. That was very, very interesting. Thank you. If you now unshare your screen, I can invite the next speaker, who is Rohini Godbole. She is at the Center for High Energy Physics at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And Rohini is a phenomenologist. She has been working in particle physics for a long time. In fact, I think we have known each other for 50 years, Rohini, because we were National Science Talent Scholars together. And Rohini has been particularly influential in raising science as a rather important issue in view of the gender divide in India. But she is primarily and foremost for us a physicist, and she'll tell us about how things look from her perspective. Rohini.
So let me first thank Amit and also Subir, because this is one of the rare forays which I make in the literary environment. And I'm afraid my talk might be much more prosaic than the first two speakers. But of course, it's in consonance with them because the basic points remain the same. Let me begin by sharing my slides. Can you see my slides? Subir, are my slides visible?
Yeah, they're visible, please.
Okay. So, as Subir already mentioned, I liked very much that there is a question mark on the title of the seminar, and therefore I would like to perhaps give my interpretation of what I think is decolonizing science, and particularly in the light of the fact that statements that are made by everybody that science is objective, but scientists are not necessarily. So what I want to talk about is that how that lack of objectivity in scientists at certain levels might have does and might have impacted the history of science. And then I would like to make 2 points, in fact, that we need to recognize, I mean, one in my own simple way, 2 specific things I would like to propose, what I think is can lead to some amount of decolonizing of science in this sort of expanded definition. And one is, I particularly am going to take 2 examples. One is the need to recognize early contributions by Indian mathematicians and put them in the context. And of course, the second one, which is really dear to my heart, that's need to recognize the importance and impact of gender diversity on science. And then, of course, at the end, I would like to sort of, since I'm suggesting this as a way to achieve some decolonization, I also would like to comment what are we going to achieve by that kind of recognition. So we begin with this, as was said by both Shobha and Ram, that science is objective. It deals with truths of nature, at least the science that most of us are here involved in. It deals with truths of nature which one extracts from analyzing or understanding a whole lot of observed data, or about with pure deductions. I mean, this sort of goes more to the things such as general relativity, number theory, and what have you. Now, it is obvious that Newton's laws of motion would have been the same no matter who had invented it. I mean, Subir already told you that. So, not just that, the impact of calculus on our sciences is going to remain exactly the same whether Newton had invented it or Leibniz had invented it. As it happened, both of them invented it. Even more important than that is that this impact that their discovery of calculus had on science was not changed by the fact that perhaps the early Indian mathematicians might have obtained, for example, series expansions, which now we understand only by use of calculus. So if this is the case, one should normally then ask the question, how does it matter? Why should we be discussing this? And that is the point that I want to discuss further. So as I said, we scientists are not necessarily objective when it comes to matters outside science, and particularly when one is trying to judge the worth of a contribution or a contributor. And one aspect of decolonizing science is just to correct the history of science, in my opinion, to include scientific developments which went either unrecognized or underappreciated or sometimes even misrepresented. And these last three things that I tell you, namely the lack of recognition or lack of appreciation or misrepresentation, happens because of either obvious or invisible biases of the scientific community. So what I would like to sort of give you and make this point clear by giving you two examples. One, I would take, as I said, examples of early Indian mathematics, and the second one about contributions of women to science. So mathematics in early India, it begins over a wide range, but here is just one slide, quick. And again, as Shobha says, you can go to Wikipedia, everything will be available there. But in the Vedic period, there is what are called Sulva Sutras, and they contain a very clear statement of Pythagoras 2 centuries before Pythagoras. Between 400 BC and 200 BC, there existed Pingala, who talked about binomial theorem as well as Pascal's triangle. 400 BC to 200 AD, there has been Jain work, which was the first time mathematics work we can see, which is separated away from religion and religious structures. And this was the first time when we see discussions of based and representations, understanding of infinities, reasonably important concepts for mathematics, and zero. And this is the only one that is known to a common person in the street in India if you ask him or her what is India's contribution in mathematics. Okay? But beyond that, that was important, but 400 AD to 1600 AD, there are two periods, 400 to 1300 and 1300 to 1600. And in this, this is a galaxy of mathematicians. Aryabhatta, Varahamihira, Brahmagupta, Bhaskara 1, Bhaskara 2. Their work was mainly inspired by applications to astronomy, whereas the Kerala school of mathematics, which was led by Madhava, Nilakantha and some more people, is much more closer to the modern mathematics and number theory. And very few people among us in India know about it. And I want to tell you, 2 minutes?
Thank you.
Okay. I want to tell you, quote some things from Dharmapal in his book Science and Technology in 18th Century India. There is a statement by Playfair in an article he wrote in the review in 1817, where he was all praise for Brahmagupta, and he said the solution then of a very different problem given by an Indian algebraist more than 1200 years ago is such as I can vie with two of the mathematicians, the most distinguished for genius and the invention which Europe could boast of ever having seen at the end of 18th century. So he is really praising Brahmagupta at this point. And in 1850, Encyclopedia Britannica quotes one Professor Leslie in his very learned work on the philosophy of arithmetic, and they give the page number 225 to 226, and he says, he calls the Leelavati, which was one of the treatises written by Bhaskara II, a very poor performance, and then he goes and says it contains among the few scanty precepts couched in obscure memorial the verses. The article then goes on to mention in Encyclopedia Britannica that Playfair also has actually now lost his sort of enamorment of Indian algebra, and he has a critique. So I just went and saw, Dharmapal actually, went and saw what the criticism was. And the criticism was actually quite different. The criticism was, if it be true that the Hindus of the present time, he's writing in 1870, understand nothing of their scientific books, the decline of knowledge among them must have been very rapid, as it is plain that at the distance of less than 2 centuries from the present time, the light of science was shining in India with considerable luster. So this is far from raising questions about the standard of developments in algebra by the Indian mathematicians. So I consider this particular statement in Encyclopedia Britannica is a case of utter misrepresentation. So this is the classic misrepresentation or underappreciation of the result by the scientific community. And this actually led to a lot of discussions, and the European historians of science and mathematicians went on to say that Indian mathematicians really did not understand what they invented. They did not really understand negative numbers even if they invented them. And I think this is the decolonization in the sense that I have defined it. It is, actually what happened further. This is just by itself is one thing. But it is these attitudes which then drove the famous, educational policies that are already mentioned, which were imposed by Mr. Macaulay. And he actually justified it by saying in so many words that, and this is something that I would read again, that I believe it is no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in Sanskrit language is less than valuable than the worth that may be found in the most paltry abridgment used at the preparatory schools in England. And clearly he justified and used this. I am afraid that the education which many of us have received, and again I think Ram referred to it, which we have all received in India as a result of this education system, it has produced a majority of intellectuals which have a bit of an apathy or even suspicion to the knowledge about that existed before the European Enlightenment really arrived. And why is it important to address it? You would say again, it's not necessary to think about it. Why should we set the record straight? It's nothing in modern day science is going to change because of this. Technology can be a different story, but I don't want to come to that. Now, there has been a lot of research on ancient Indian mathematics, and I will, there are names that I wrote. Last word needs to be said, but important misconceptions now have been removed. But now I want to go to the last point. Why is it important to understand this and set the record straight? Because I think this kind of misrepresentation actually impacts science and society in tangible and intangible ways. For the ancient mathematics, let me quote the tangible ways. And I quote from an article in Frontline, which was written by a famous current Indian mathematician, Professor Dani. And he says that notwithstanding the enviable background, that is of ancient mathematics, lack of adequate and academic pursuit over a prolonged period, occasioned by several factors, together with about 2 centuries of Macaulayan education, has unfortunately resulted, on the one hand, in a lack of awareness, which I already talked about, of our historical roles in actual terms. But the other one, which I think is more serious, is that on the other hand, it has given an empty sense of pride, which is more of an emotional reaction to the colonial domination rather than an intellectual challenge. And that is what then gives rise to Vedic mathematics, which is neither Vedic nor mathematics. And that then becomes the rage. So I believe that setting the record straight is something which is important for our scientific community and our understanding of science as it goes, which should be correct. On the other hand, a proper realization that the Indian achievements, that they did not begin only with Ramanujan, can actually, in my mind, inspire many young minds, just like a Vishwanathan Anand can inspire many more young people than a Gary Kasparov ever will. So to my mind, this aspect of decolonizing science is important for India's sort of this is the one that I talked about. Vedic mathematics is the tangible one, which is really required for us to take care of that, and the other is a more intangible one, but which is important for India's future, okay, in science. And I could go on exactly the same lines about women, but I can see that Subir will be raising hands, so I will not comment on it. But I want to say, It is exactly the same story. I mean, I wanted to begin with a story that was Sandy Toksvig once made, and she told that in her anthropology class, she realized that the discovery of calendar, somebody showed in the class, this is the first calendar invented by a man. And the calendar, this was a bone with 28 carvings on it. And then the woman professor asked her, pray, which man would need to keep track of 28 days? So the first calendar was actually invented by a woman. Now you would say, okay, what difference does it make if it is man or woman? It's a global heritage, common inheritances. But what happens is that this kind of lack of appreciation that women were involved in scientific processes and can be involved and make important contributions, this lack of awareness sort of produces very illogical obstacles for women doing science. And in fact, I want to go with one example in this, and I was going to give 3 examples. One is an example of Sophie Germain, who was not allowed to study science, mathematics formally for a long time. And I think this is a case where she might have made much more contribution than she already did. This is from Europe of 18th century. Then there is Elena Lucrezia Cornaro from 17th century Italy. She wanted to study theology, but she was told that women are not capable of studying theology. So she should be studying mathematics. As luck would have it, she actually studied something that was worthwhile, and she was the first woman PhD from University of Padua. And just to tell you that this is a space and time independent situation, I give you a 3rd story of R.J. Hanskill. She is a PhD in 1965 from Punjab. And just look on the right, I have given you a photograph of her dressed as a boy so that she could go to a school where she can study mathematics. And she got a PhD in 1965. So we are talking of India, which was just around independence, where this had to be done. And I think this is the impact that you have when you deny the fact that women can contribute to science. So these are my 2 bits, that decolonizing science means that you should try to make efforts such that one can recognize the contributions that are made by people which in our opinion are not major contributors to science. And it is not for these underrepresented groups alone, it is for the good of science also. So that is really the point that I want to make. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you. They're both rather important points and very timely as well. So I'm sure there'll be discussion of that later. But let me now continue to invite our last panelist. This is Somak Raychaudhury. As I mentioned, he's an astronomer. He's the director of the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics at Pune. And he has also been the head of physics at Presidency University. But I've known Somak since he was an undergraduate in Oxford very many years ago. So I'm sure he will listen to me if I tell him he has got 10 minutes, because we are already through half of what was allocated for our question time. But I'm sure he has rather important points to make. So please, Somak, go ahead. You are muted, Somak.
Thanks very much. I'll try to keep to the time. I thought I work at the IUCAA in Pune in India, and I just outside my office here in our quad are statues of various scientists, which were built by the people who make idols of Ganesh for the pujas in Bombay. And the 2 across the quad are Newton sitting under a banyan tree. And you can see the kids who visit our institute playing with the grandfather. And there's an apple in front of him. We don't know where it came from. It's under a banyan tree. And then right across the quad is this image of Aryabhatta, which of course we don't know what he looked like. This was built by these image makers, and this is now the Wikipedia photograph of Aryabhatta. So the contrasts, I think, kind of summarize today's theme.
Somak, you are muted again.
Okay. I thought I'd start by asking whether there was ever a pre-colonial paradigm, and is there some kind of a continuity? The modern, what we call modern science, which with rests on the formulation of Copernicus, the Newton, Darwin, as we study now in India, is what we practice. I did not learn Newton's laws as an undergraduate at Oxford. I learned it and together with the periodic table and the theory of evolution as a school kid in Calcutta. But this modern science is some kind of an anomaly. It happened only once in the history of humans. It so happens that it was concurrent with the Christianization of the world, as well as it was followed by the Industrial Revolution, which led to a very rapid economic growth. And so somehow I think this modern science that we practice got kind of connected, I think, with the inextricably with the various aspects of colonization. But I also want to ask, did our colonizers learn anything, any of the paradigms? I mean, I'm talking major paradigms, I'm not talking of individual scientific papers, from the vast knowledge systems of the colonized nations, like in India. And we know of the decimal system. We just heard about the Bhaskaras and Madhava and Aryabhatta. Perhaps the best example of the reverse flow as a direct result of colonization would be Panini. I mean, if you look at Latin grammar textbooks from the 16th and 15th centuries, you would see what an impact the discovery of Sanskrit and of Panini by William Jones in the 1780s made to the study of the science of language, of grammar. And so that was what colonization gained from the colonies. And I'm sure there are many, many examples. And contemporaries, we just in physics, I put down some names of people who made some amazing contributions, which led to not, I mean, various details. I mean, the horn antenna invented by J.C. Bose in the 1880s, won in a different format 3 Nobel Prizes later on in the 20th century. So the question is, when we look at colonization, are we looking at the pre-colonial colonial paradigms continuing directly to the science we practice today? Is it important to know which ones, what streams came directly to us? Why is there not a stream that came from Aryabhatta and Bhaskara and Madhava to the things we study in the schools today? And is that because of the education system itself? And this is why I thought I'd concentrate today on the education system itself and how we learn. How local does science need to be? What is science? Science represents an analytical approach to understanding real-world problems that crop up in our real lives. We deal with abstract concepts like mass, energy, gravity, natural selection, in order to explain phenomena that happen in our lives. So in a sense, we're trying to explain local phenomena, but there have to be problems that are local in nature. Can they be solved by universal concepts of science? Science is, as opposed to other forms of knowledge, has another aspect, and that requires observation. What is inaccessible to any kind of observation is close to science. This includes the world of the spirits, for example, or what happened before the Big Bang, or something like that. We cannot observe it, and so we do not deal with them in science. And so science has a particular dimension that we need to understand when we talk about these paradigms that are universal or local. And this is one of the reasons I think why science is more universal than local, but we cannot ignore the local aspects of science. The basics of science may not be culture specific, but some of the paradigms might need to be, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Just to look at what used to be taught in universities. I said I concentrated on education, used to be taught at universities all over the world. In antiquity, in Nalanda, for example, which reached its peak in 7th, 8th centuries, the Buddhist university in India taught theology, taught philosophy. A lot of that has continuity even now, taught law, taught astronomy and mathematics in forms which a lot of that are true even now, and we have quite a lot of the very basics of astronomy that was taught in Nalanda are taught now in terms of spherical trigonometry. They taught the grammar of Panini. They taught urban planning and architecture, and various versions of the Pythagorean theorem were taught in that in designing buildings and cities. I wanted to know what Newton had in his syllabus in Cambridge in 17th century England. And these are things he learned. He had to learn classics, he had to learn ethics. It was not that he was learning science, quote unquote. He learned divinity, he learned philosophy, and he learned, and of course, then he contributed a lot. He created the subjects that we call science now, but he had to learn the same astronomy and trigonometry in very much, basically the same forms as the students learned in Nalanda in the 9th century AD. These disciplines became disciplines, and we now think of disciplines as science, and thus divide the disciplines in terms of universality and localization. These got defined only in the mid-19th century. I mean, if you look at when these subjects were delineated, this is a quote from the handbooks of Oxford and Cambridge at that time, the 3R exams, the honors and the honor programs, which now we adopt universally worldwide, into the schools of mathematics, the schools of humanities, natural sciences. These were all mixed up in over our history, and I think we are getting to a stage where these need to be mixed up again. Interdisciplinarity is very important. I just wanted to give one example, if I may, where I'm talking about how important is the development of local paradigms of science in the long term. And I wanted to give an example from my own subject, astronomy. If you look at the astronomy of China and the astronomy of Greece and Europe and India, they are essentially the same because they talked to each other 2,000 years ago. We have 64 constellations all over the sky. We look at stars, we join the dots, etc., etc., etc. To India, because of very interesting reasons, and to the ancient Greeks, the path of the sun in the sky, which is called the ecliptic, was very important because all the planets also followed. The sun and the planets lie in the same plane, and they follow the same line in the sky. So somebody postulated this is very local, that line is very, very sacred. That path is sacred, and so we divided that into the 12 houses of the zodiac, and we studied that only. Whereas in China, it was believed that all the sky is important because any important phenomena like earthquakes or floods or change of king would be indicated in the sky. So they kept absolutely meticulous records of the entire sky. And for the last 2,000 years, we have those records. And Joseph Needham went and unearthed all this stuff. And how does that affect us now? We study supernovae. We study supernovae, which are amazing phenomena. These are when stars explode. And so when supernovae happen, everybody is affected because when a star explodes in the galaxy, and the last time it happened was in the 18th century, if it is near enough, you see two suns in the sky. There is no night. When 1054 AD, the Crab Nebula event happened in Taurus, there was no night for 2 weeks. There should have been poems written about them. It affected everybody. And yet there is absolutely no record of it in the Western canon, because at that time, the Christian world believed that anything that changed in the sky was a sign from the devil. And so you don't write it down. We don't write poems about it. You go to the Chinese records and you find it there described in great detail. It would have been seen anywhere from the Northern Hemisphere. You find, and this is what local scientific paradigms, local beliefs can give to science. Just because the Chinese recorded the sky, we now look through the last 2,000 years of Chinese records, and we know about what happened in the sky, how stars changed, and it helps our current science. So it's very important to look at the local aspect of science, and in particular in countries where colonization did not try to kind of level the playing field. And so I'll come to my last point, and I'm talking about indigenization of science and technology. I mean, I think indigenization of technology is inevitable. It is going to happen. And there are some very, very good examples where countries who were ex-colonial countries, ex-colonized countries, have attempted very directly to come out of the clutches of the colonizing world and the Western world. And the good examples in India, for example, in the 1980s and 1990s, when there was a total embargo, the height of the Cold War, on technologies coming to India, India developed its own supercomputer. It was not allowed a Cray, so Param was done here, just across the road here from my institution in CDAC. Similarly, just out of this kind of necessity, India has developed its own nuclear arsenal, its new nuclear power, its defense, and its own space infrastructure. And much of it is indigenized. Much of it comes from indigenous sources. Much of it is designed to use our resources that are in the country. So that is a no-brainer, and that is, part of our decoupling from the effects of colonization. We, of course, in sciences like psychology or anthropology, for example, that is an inevitable aspect as well. I mean, when we look at the study of psychology, one has to bring in local elements. We cannot completely analyze things in a Western paradigm. But science, the way I talked about, the science of Newton and Darwin, and the theoretical sciences that we practice, which essentially rests on analytical thinking that tries to understand complex phenomena. Ultimately, does it matter whether the solution of general relativity describing the collapse of a star was done by N.R. Sen and Visheshwar Datta, or it was done by Oppenheimer, even though they are given the names of both people? Does it matter? For example, I did not study Latin grammar in Oxford, but if I did, my professors would not have told me what parts of that Latin grammar were actually written by Panini or based on Panini. So I think that is probably why we're discussing this today, to look at how science can be indigenized and whether there is any necessity. Thanks.
Thanks, Shor. Those are all very interesting points, and what I've become very conscious of is that I know Einstein said time is relative, but we all clearly have very flexible interpretations of 10 minutes. The problem is that we have actually run out of time completely for the question session, but Amit has very kindly agreed that we can carry on till the next talk by Francesca Orsini, which is in 15 minutes. So we do have time to take a few questions, and I would ask for the responses to be as sharp as possible, because otherwise you won't be able to address them. And so I'm going to be selective. There's a question by Subodh Patil, which is to all of us, but I would suggest that Shobo address this in order to be to the point. It says, you all raised some interesting points. However, the discussion is quite India-centric and India-specific. However, India is just one of many cultures that were subject to colonialism. What do you think the process of decolonization of science should entail, say, for our African and Latin American colleagues? What do you think decolonizing science should entail as a general category? And a similar issue was also raised earlier by Saikat Majumdar, which I'll mention in the same context. His question is, to what degree the narratives that we have focused on, including the attribution of knowledge and discoveries to people and cultures and so on, what difference does it actually make to domains of scientific knowledge and the disciplinary development? So are there any particular disciplinary consequences in respective fields? Sorry, that was a rather long question, but Shobo, do you want to address the point about how these issues which you have discussed in the Indian context, by virtue of our backgrounds, might be generalized to all colonized peoples in the world?
I'll give you a very quick answer. I don't know so much about the histories of various colonies. Therefore, I concentrated on what I think I know. I may not even know that. I'll just give you a quick anecdote that Galileo is widely known as the father of optics and so on. But there was a man in the 10th century Alexandria named Al-Hatham. Al-Hazen was his, sorry, how did I get there? Okay, sorry. My computer is misbehaving.
No, it's fine, we can hear you. Yeah.
So Al-Hatham is the father of optics. There's a book of optics. Until about 3-4 years ago, most people I knew in the US had never heard of him, nor have I. So if you look at Al-Hatham, he basically figured out how we see. And it's shocking that before 10th century, we didn't know how we see. And he figured it out, and he figured much else out. So there are these incidents that exist in history about various cultures, and I think that the job is of the historians of science to excavate these informations for themselves. And I chose not only to speak only of India, but only my neck of the woods, about which I know a little bit. In fact, I just concentrated on the eastern part of India, so it is not even about India. So that's where I will leave it. I know no more.
I think that's a very fair point. Rohini, would you like to say anything very quickly?
No, frankly, I mean, I just like Shobho has said, I mean, I talked about two things that I thought I understood a little bit.
No, I meant because you have broad experience in the sense of you do engage with colleagues in Latin America, in Africa, elsewhere, as part of our international activities.
No, I would not be, I am not aware of their
personal experience.
History is exactly what Shobho mentioned. I really don't.
Can I just add?
Can
I just add one statement as a historical record, that between Archimedes and Copernicus, there is no significant idea of physical science that emanated from Europe, and that's 1700 years, which is when Moorish Spain and North Africa were the center of knowledge and civilization. So in the long arch of history, time scales are important. And so I'll just leave it there.
No, that's a very important point. Thank you for
that's
making this point.
That's perfectly valid. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. There are a lot of other questions coming in, so let's carry on. I think, well, for a start, Soumitra Banerjee, who's on the panel, had his hand up. So, Soumitra, can you ask your question very quickly?
He's muted.
Well, I've allowed him to unmute.
My hand was up by chance.
Okay, never mind then. Let's then carry on because Soumitra is on. Soumitra?
Soumitra said that his hand was up by
accident. Okay, never mind. Then let us proceed. So there was a question which was actually, this is something looking forward to the future. So, and as it happens, I have a slide to answer this. So I shall do that. This is a question from Manjushri, who says, what, if any, are your hopes for the science world and our world at large, ray decolonization of science? Is there any hope for our world to willingly create a more harmonious coexistence? I think that's a sort of a pretty positive note. And to answer that, if I may, I'll quickly show you something that I had actually had a slide about. And this is to illustrate how far we have come in this regard. You can see here a photograph from the Wellcome collection of a anti-cholera program being carried out in Calcutta slightly over 100 years ago. And you can see that it's a carefully staged photograph. The Indians are the background. The white man in the center administering the inoculation is obviously the subject. and the compounder at the left is what you might call the subaltern in the game. But now let's fast forward 100 years. We have records now to a database which was set up 100 years after that photograph by an American physicist. The suggestion actually came from a colleague of ours in India that this would be of great benefit to the world, especially those in countries which are not as central as the US or UK or Europe in deciding how science is done. And this archive is now the biggest repository of scientific documents in the world. About 1.5 billion people have read articles from it. And the point is that one of the first papers to be archived was that by a young, at the time young Indian physicist called Ashok Sen, who was awarded the first breakthrough prize in fundamental physics. So the point that I would make into the questioner is that although this is an example from some subset of the sciences, I do not believe this sort of democratization and open access and the notion of open science has happened all the way through. Nevertheless, it shows that science can be decolonized by this kind of equality of access and providing a level playing field. This is what we have to work towards now, while keeping in mind all the things that the panelists have said about, the ignoring of historical contributions and the importance, as Rohini established, of recognizing them even today in order to inspire the future generation, right? And we believe that this is much more important than polemics or virtue signaling, which unfortunately often takes over from doing something tangible in this regard. All right. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll take new questions. So the further questions that have come in on the chat currently on the question and answer. So Anita Ramphal says, decolonizing science is not just about acknowledging science of the colonies, but also to question concepts such as invention, which attributes it to one person, often at the cost of acknowledging decades of earlier work, or also to look at how the knowledge of artisans and farmers, etc., were appropriated by educated scientists. Well, this was actually commented on both by Ramaswamy and Rohini Godbole. I don't know, Ram, do you want to add something to that quickly?
Yeah, I would like to actually also comment on this fact of course, our discussion has been very India-centric because all of us are Indians, and this is the colony that we know most about. But I do think that, there are very many parallels in other countries, particularly in terms of denying the indigenous knowledge of the colonized countries, as well as, I think, in a more insidious way, creating at least a two stratum or a multiple strata of intellectual societies in these countries. People who know and those who support Western or support the colonial narrative and those that don't. So I think that there will be parallels to be found where one looks not just in Pakistan, which is essentially us, but also in other nations that have had this particular experience. So I think that the denial of an indigenous or a local knowledge, that is a very common thing that goes in almost all countries with the colonial experience. Also because these countries have been very good places for export. So if you deny the existence of basic amenities there, you have a market to export to. This clearly merits longer discussion, but yeah.
I think that's a fair enough point. There is a question here slightly more sensitive from Debashri Mukherjee, who says, I would like the panelists to weigh in on the ways in which calls to decolonize science can and have been co-opted by Hindutva nationalism. There is something odd happening here in the name of patriotism in the official political discourse. My question is, how do you understand decolonizing science as more than a national question? Also, can our efforts to recuperate Indian histories of science stay independent of different political interests? Now, this again is something that Rohini alluded to when she emphasized that our appreciation of ancient mathematics, she referred to Vedic mathematics that was neither Vedic nor mathematics. So I think unless somebody would like to add to that, I don't know. Do any of you want to comment on that quickly?
No, I just want to say that precisely I think if we study it in an academic fashion and if we convey the proper scientific information, one can reduce the possibility of exactly the hypes and the misrepresentation. I mean, as scientists, I think we owe this to the society. See, if on the Indian Mathematics Day, we only celebrate Ramanujan, and I think that's why I like that particular statement that Dani has made.
Yes,
That there are, by acknowledging it and by celebrating what is really true, we can actually move ahead with times. At least that's the way I see it.
Can I make just one short
Please.
comment?
Yeah.
And that is because I'm trying to write a book, I'm reading and looking through archives and so forth. And what is really shocking is how little of this knowledge that can be very commonly available is actually available. And again, I have to say that decolonizing science is a complicated proposition, because what do you mean by something that we hold only nature to be the guide as to whether it's correct or not, at least in the natural sciences. In formal sciences, it's even more stringent. Keeping saying that you have to decolonize science as if an electron in Calcutta is different from an electron in California, and as far as we know, that's not the case. So can we decolonize the Calcutta electron? And the answer is no. And I think my colleagues will agree. But so there has to be a little bit of caution in saying that. And the modern situation, I have found that they have the origin in the same thing. In one of my slides, I told you about the modernist and the revivalist agendas, and they come from the same source of a deep sense of insecurity and inferiority that was available then. So they grew out of the same soil of discomfort, because not only we read Newton, we also read Voltaire. So, and there is no problem. I don't see any problem in recognizing Voltaire as my legacy. So, so this overemphasis of nationalist notions, if you are not careful, then nature will have our vacuum.
Indeed.
If we don't do it right,
Sure.
some loonies will take charge of it.
So we have to do it right.
That's a fair point, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time, and I would not have time to take further questions that have come in, which are interesting, but let me quickly read out one and the response to it. So Mastura Alata says, if science is more exportable and learnable across cultural and linguistic boundaries than the humanities, why are so many countries still so backward? Is this the kind of question that the decolonial project should engage with? And this has already been replied to by Madhushri Mukherjee, who is, of course, a scientist herself by training. She did her PhD with Yoshiro Nambu at Chicago on string theory. And she says, what does backward mean? That in itself is a colonial notion. Fair enough. We could go on that riff alone for another hour, but we afraid we really have run out of time, because Francesca Orsini, the next speaker, is due to speak in a minute. But she herself has a question. Well, Francesca, sorry, it will delay your talk, but I must read it out. She says, but at least in what we read in the papers, scientific experiments and samples are not neutral, are they? Well, that I think I'm reluctant to ask any of our panel to riff on that, because that's a very long that's a topic that will take a long time to engage with, and we do not want to delay your talk, which we are looking forward to. So I think
Can I give a one-word answer?
please.
No.
Yes, I think we all agree with you, Shobha. Exactly. We are not neutral, nor is any human activity. The question is more to what extent do we recognize and allow for our bias in whatever we do, whether it's even in scientific experiment. The idea that one can ever be truly neutral is an impossibility, and scientists recognize that very well. Anyway, I think that was a fascinating discussion, and I first must apologize to my panelists who really had so much to say and who I rudely had to cut short. It really should have allowed far more time for this, but this is the first time that we are doing this, so perhaps we can learn from this for the future. So at this point, may I ask Amit to come back online and basically shepherd us off this panel. Amit?
Yes, I'm shepherding you off. Thank you so much for this really fascinating session. I mean, on many levels. And about the question of nationalism, I meant to kind of speak about it in my introductory remark. It's a question that occurs to us. The lack of interest that nationalists. By nationalists now we mean, I suppose, the present dispensation. Because there are other kinds of nationalists as well. We don't agree with them either, but we are not talking about the secular nationalists, but the ones who have a different idea of science, who are kind of, I think, taking the proper vaccines themselves, but have been talking about Gomutra earlier on as a solution. So I don't think that they are very interested in science. I mean, they are interested in the notion of science, but they invariably find it in the flying chariots of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, or plastic surgery for Ganesh. But actually, they seem to be completely uninterested, disengaged from science. I mean, that's the impression that I get. At least I might be wrong. So there are so many perspectives, and as on this subject, and as Subir pointed out, and others have, we could go on for a long time, and maybe we should on another occasion. Maybe we should return to this discussion. Yes, questions have been coming up about recordings becoming available so that you can revisit these discussions, and yes, they should be available in a week or two after the symposium, maybe a couple of weeks. Thank you again to all of you. It was genuinely absorbing what you had to say. Thank you.